Welcome to the very best part of my broadcast week. And those of you watching on Paramount Plus or CBS News 24/7, welcome to the Takeout Lounge, as we like to refer to it here in the CBS Washington Bureau. I want to thank our stage manager and stagehands for putting all this together for us, as always. You know, many times on this program we look outward, but sometimes we look inward. And what I mean by looking inward, we bring in some of the best CBS reporters to help us understand a big issue in front of the country. And this week we're going to do precisely that with one of the best, youngest reporters in America on immigration. I've watched this young reporter grow at CBS, and he has become a formidable force on reporting about all immigration matters. And don't take my word for it. Take the word of his competitors, who are relentlessly chasing him because he's ahead of the curve more often than not. His name, Camilo Montoya-Galvez. Camilo, it's great to have you with us. Thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here, Major. That was really generous. Thank you for that.
It's all true. It's all true. Listen, we're going to talk in this conversation about immigration, recent past, but I want to start with where we're heading.
Sure.
You wrote a piece for our CBSNews.com website about how the military might be involved in an incoming Trump administration's efforts to achieve what it has talked about relentlessly: mass deportations.
And specifically, the largest deportation operation in American history.
Walk my audience through what that might look like and under what legal auspices.
The reason why the incoming Trump administration, Major, is considering enlisting the help of the military, the U.S. Department of Defense, for this operation is because right now the U.S. federal government does not have sufficient manpower or resources to carry out the operation that they're outlining at this scale, right? They're talking about potentially deporting up to 1 million people per year annually. That really has never been done before by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the federal agency that deals with arresting and deporting people who are in the country illegally. Right now, that agency, ICE, has about 6,000 law enforcement agents and about 41,000 detention beds. That is not nearly enough to detain, arrest, locate, and deport everyone who is in the country illegally. The last estimate by DHS is that around 11 million people are in the country without legal permission. They are here illegally. That number probably is higher now, given the record numbers of releases of migrants along the border under this Biden administration. And so ICE right now does not have the manpower, the tools, and the resources to carry out the operation that the incoming administration is promising. And so they are looking for ways and avenues to potentially get to a very high level of annual deportations. And one of those avenues could be enlisting the help of the military. Tom Homan, the incoming border czar, has suggested to us that the Department of Defense could potentially provide operational assistance to ICE by letting the agency use military planes to carry out deportations, by helping the agency set up facilities along the border as staging grounds to remove undocumented immigrants, and also by helping DHS set up 10 facilities to detain migrants who are awaiting deportation. Because, yes, you have to locate these people, Major, and that takes time, resources, and manpower, but you also have to hold them usually for days, if not weeks, before their host country, their home country, is able to agree to their return. And some countries, of course, like Venezuela right now, do not accept U.S. deportations, which is another topic. But yes, that is the plan. The only open question is whether the incoming administration is able to use the military and potentially the National Guard to directly arrest and deport immigrants, which is something that, for example, incoming Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller has talked about, deputizing the National Guard in so-called friendly states. Friendly states could include Virginia, Texas, with Republican governors who are allied with the incoming administration, and to use those National Guard units to find people and to deport them. There is longstanding federal law that says the military cannot be involved in civilian law enforcement. That would include the enforcement of federal immigration laws, but that restriction does not cover state National Guard units. So that could be the potential loophole that they use to maybe enlist the help of the National Guard to carry out this operation.
All right, let's take those two things. The last thing you mentioned about the National Guard, let's just set that aside for a moment. Everything else you talked about, operational support, flights, maybe military staging areas, is all that permissible under federal law with no changes or alterations as we currently understand it?
Well, I think the best way to answer that question is that for the past 30 years, the military has been providing support to Customs and Border Protection at the U.S.-Mexico border by not only assisting the agency with logistics and surveillance, but also construction, barrier construction, and also intelligence gathering at the border. So the military has been under Republican and Democratic administrations providing support to CBP, Customs and Border Protection at the border to help that agency carry out the immigration enforcement mission. But using military planes has never been done before, and that would go a step further. The legality of that is still unclear, but it seems to be less legally dubious than the actual proposal to have active duty troops find people and arrest them and potentially deport them from the U.S.
And would the only legal barrier to enlisting the National Guard in any given state, would that only barrier be the compliance of the sitting governor?
Potentially, if the National Guard is under state control, they can carry out civilian law enforcement, including on the enforcement of immigration law.
Would there need to be a declaration of some kind of emergency in order to do that, or could you do it just under regular procedures?
From what I have been told by legal experts, the governors have wide-ranging discretion to use the National Guard under state control to carry out civilian law enforcement, and that would include immigration enforcement. But there is some talk within the Trump circles that they can potentially declare a national emergency, just like they did the first time around, to divert funding from the Department of Homeland Security, another key resource element, towards immigration enforcement. As you may recall, the first Trump administration actually diverted money not only from disaster aid, FEMA funding, but also from the military for construction of border barriers, but also to set up 10 facilities along the border to hear the cases of people returned to Mexico under the so-called Remain in Mexico policy. So that administration, during the first term at least, did try to do that, and it's very possible that they could try to do that again.
You talked about land. The Texas Land Commissioner recently gave a press conference in which she said she would provide land to the federal government, to the Trump administration specifically, for facilities to hold deportees. This is something we should be bracing ourselves for, it sounds like.
I think so. And I think one very interesting dynamic that we should be tracking is how much state governments like Texas help the administration carry out this massive operation. As you know, Texas Governor Greg Abbott has been very active in the space over the past years, not only busing migrants to Democratic-led cities, but setting up razor wire along the banks of the Rio Grande to deter migrants from crossing that river, also deploying the National Guard there to effectively stop people from entering U.S. soil and blocking them from requesting asylum under federal and international law, but also trying to enact his own state immigration laws so Texas Department of Public Safety officials, state troopers, and others can actually arrest migrants for immigration violations, which is historically a federal responsibility, administering immigration laws and setting immigration regulations. And so I believe that Texas Governor Greg Abbott will do as much as he can to help the incoming administration carry out this operation, not only by offering land that can be used to hold immigrants awaiting deportation, but perhaps also by lending the support of the National Guard and state troopers to help ICE fulfill many of these missions, which again, right now the agency is not fully equipped to do.
We have so much more to get to with Camilo Montoya-Galvez. Immigration, what we just talked about is the future. We're going to talk a little bit about what's happened in the Biden administration. That's segment 2 of the Takeout in just 1 second.
There was a lot of public backlash to what the Trump administration did at the border, including the zero-tolerance policy of separating families.
Welcome back to the Takeout. Camilo Montoya-Galvez of CBS News is our special guest. It's great to have you with us. So I've heard this said about Biden administration policy up until the last 5 or 6 months when it became much more restrictive. Something goes like this. The Biden administration intentionally created an asylum process that could be gamed by people who wanted to enter the United States but might not necessarily have a credible case to assert that they qualified for asylum under U.S. or international law. And that so many people came in this way that the system was essentially broken by the permissiveness of the Biden administration. How would you evaluate that overall description of the, say, the first 3 years of the Biden administration approach to the border?
To level set a bit, Major, historically migration flows are induced and driven by two main factors, what we call push and pull factors. Push factors being the conditions in home countries, the source countries, that prompt people to migrate, to flee. In some cases, that could be
economic
corruption,
privation,
poverty,
violence.
It could be political persecution,
Right.
It could be an earthquake, a natural disaster. And pull factors are the reasons why the U.S. attracts immigration and why people are pulled into the U.S. That could be being able to stay here despite not having a valid asylum case for years and being able to work here despite not having a legitimate case. That could be the strength of the U.S. economy relative to other nations in the Western Hemisphere post-COVID, and the availability, the ample supply of open jobs here in the U.S. that in some cases are going unfilled because many local Americans, be it legal citizens or longstanding native-born Americans, are not doing. And also the fact that many of the people coming have family already established here who they want to reunite with. So family reunification, the prospect of being able to stay here despite not having the legal basis to stay here, and also the idea that there is a lot of job openings here in the U.S. that are available to immigrants. And while they may not be very attractive to you or to me or to my parents or to other Americans, they are attractive to new arrivals because they're making a lot more money than they would in their home countries, and they can actually send money back home. Now, to directly answer your question, even Biden administration officials, former and current, will tell me now that they believe the administration took too many actions too quickly early on that sent the wrong message on this issue. That, for example, when they instituted a deportation moratorium, when they announced that they would halt deportations for 100 days, even though that policy only applied to longstanding immigrants and not to recent arrivals at the border, it sent the wrong message. They also would say that suspending the Remain in Mexico policy that the Trump administration set up, even though that policy was largely not being used during the pandemic because Title 42, another border measure, was in place, it still sent the wrong message to suspend it early on. And so they believe that the perfect storm really was ushered in when they sent the wrong message through those policy reversals.
Those became pull factors.
Right. They became pull factors, and smugglers who control the movement of the illicit movement of people and drugs across the hemisphere, Mexico, along Panama and Colombia, the very busy transitory routes across the Western Hemisphere, have been using that message that the U.S. is now more generous, permissive under the Biden administration than under Trump to really fuel migration to the U.S. and obviously to make a lot of money. This is a highly profitable, multi-billion-dollar industry now that facilitates immigration not just from people in South and Central America, but also from Africa, Asia. We have seen record numbers of people from China, for example, come to the U.S. border from Africa, in addition to the more traditional sending countries like Venezuela, Central America, and Mexico. And so, yes, even Biden administration officials, Major, would concede that they took too many actions early on too quickly to reverse Trump administration policies, but they would say that they did so because public opinion at the time was in a different place, that there was a lot of public backlash to what the Trump administration did at the border, including the zero tolerance policy of separating families. But they do feel like at this point that they overreacted in some ways.
Clearly the politics reflected in the 2024 election underscore that very plainly.
That's right.
There are a lot of things, as you know, Camilo, around immigration that are impressionistic. One of the impressions people have is, well, there's an app that you can use, and when you use an app to claim asylum, it's way too easy. Come on, what did they do that for? Is that true? Is that a valid impression? or impressionistic but needs more context?
Well,
or
there is an
explanation?
application administered by the U.S. government, set up under this administration, that allows people who are waiting in Mexico, whether they are from Mexico or another third country, to basically secure an appointment to be processed at an official border crossing. These are known as ports of entry. And that is actually the way that people are supposed to be seeking asylum, because if you cross the border in between ports of entry, you can request asylum. It is legal, but it is also illegal to cross in between a port of entry without the inspection of a U.S. Border Patrol official. So the administration has been using the CBP One app, it's called, to basically allow people to request an appointment to be processed in an orderly and legal fashion at ports of entry, and to basically discourage people from doing it illegally, from crossing the border between the ports of entry. But the incoming administration is saying that that circumvents what Congress has done on legal immigration, the limits that it has placed on legal immigration, and that it is an overreach of an authority known as parole that allows the president to admit people who otherwise would not qualify to come here. But again, the administration argues, the Biden administration at least, that it relieves some of the pressure at the border by diverting people to legal immigration channels. But this incoming administration has said that it will terminate this app. The concern is whether the people who are still waiting in Mexico, Major, and I've met many of them, grow increasingly desperate and decide to cross the border illegally, and that could potentially lead to a spike in migration, at least in the long term, in the short term rather. And so that is one concern. But the app is there, but it is not necessarily an app to request asylum. It is an app just to request entry into the U.S. so that person or that family can, years in the future, request asylum. And I say years in the future because the U.S. immigration system is massively backlogged. And on average right now, it takes about 4 years to adjudicate an asylum claim.
Yet, you can be inside the United States.
That's right.
While that process goes on, and that's something that also frustrates the incoming administration.
That is completely correct right now because it takes so long to have these cases adjudicated. That serves as a pull factor because it basically guarantees that if you are released into the country, you have at least 4 or maybe even more years to work in the country legally, because after you apply for asylum, you are eligible for a work permit by the U.S. government, regardless of the merits of your case. And so that is designed to make sure that they don't become public burdens on the U.S. government and the U.S. society as a whole, but it also incentivizes migration by people who are not legitimate asylum seekers. It also hurts legitimate asylum seekers because they spend years in legal limbo without having finality in their cases. So it's bad for everyone. For the U.S. government because it drives migration to the U.S. It's bad for legitimate asylum seekers who stay in this legal limbo for years. And it's also really bad for the people who are misusing the system because even though they get to work here for a couple years, they're never going to be on a permanent path to legal status in the U.S. and will eventually have to either go into the underground economy or be deported from the U.S.
And that work permit is not the same thing as a green card.
It is not. It is not. To get a green card, you either have to have an employer or a U.S. citizen relative sponsor you, and that process can take years because of backlogs and because of numerical caps that Congress has put on legal immigration.
So you have a work permit, you are at the very thinnest layer documented, but you're not documented in any other protective way.
That's right. And many of the people who are currently here in the U.S. without permanent legal status are working here under temporary Biden administration programs like temporary protected status, something known as parole, and also a policy known as CHNV that allows people to fly into the country legally if they have a sponsor, but they're only allowed to work for 2 or 3 year increments, and those policies can be revoked by another administration, and that is what President-elect Trump has promised to do. And so hundreds of thousands of people could find themselves now in legal limbo and facing the prospect of deportation or self-deportation if they decide to go back to their home countries if conditions here deteriorate. And so it's not ideal for anyone, for people to be in this legal limbo. But obviously, this administration would argue that the reason they did that and gave people a chance to work here legally is because that is better than the alternative, which is just people working in the underground economy where they can be victimized and exploited
in some other way. Right. Camilo Montoya-Galvez. When we come back, we're going to talk about a number, 300,000. The incoming border czar, Tom Homan, refers to it a lot. We'll talk about that and what it's about in segment 3 of The Takeout in just 1 second.
It could be that some of these children are being victimized, trafficked, or exploited, and some of them could be effectively missing.
Welcome back to the Takeout. For those of you on Paramount Plus and CBS News 24/7, welcome back to the Takeout Lounge. Hope you're enjoying my very strong Sox game this episode. Camilo Montoya-Galvez is our special guest. Tom Homan, the incoming border czar for the Trump administration gives a lot of interviews.
Yes,
and in almost every interview, he refers to this number, 300,000 missing children that the Biden administration has lost track of, that he asserts are, to his way of thinking, either being raped or in some other way sexually exploited.
Or trafficked.
Yeah. What do we know about this number? What do we know about the fate of these children? And how did they come to be in this condition?
So what we know is that this figure comes from a report by the Department of Homeland Security Office of Inspector General, which obviously provides oversight for the department. And they released a report earlier this year that found that about 300,000 unaccompanied migrant children who crossed the border without their parents or legal guardians have not shown up to court or have not received the proper documents to be able to attend a court hearing. And again, the immigration court system is the one that will adjudicate their claims and decide whether or not they have a legal basis, be it asylum or another immigration benefit, to be able to stay here legally. So about 300,000 unaccompanied children, according to this report, have not received a court hearing or have not shown up to those court hearings. And if they do not show up to those court hearings, they can be ordered deported in absentia from the country. That is what the number refers to. Homan is saying that that means that the Biden administration has effectively lost these children or that they are missing. But again, just because a child has not shown up to court or has not received a court notice does not mean that that child is necessarily lost. It could be that some of these children are being victimized, trafficked, or exploited, and some of them could be effectively missing or at least not being tracked by the U.S. government constantly. That is true, but it doesn't mean that all of them are missing because, for example, one reason that ICE has not been able to provide court notices to many of these unaccompanied children is because it prioritizes the placement of adults and families with children into the immigration court system because they are the most likely to be able to be deported from the country. Unaccompanied children have a higher rate of being able to get asylum or a special visa for children and minors who are abused or neglected by at least one or two parents. And so they have a better chance of being able to stay here. And so ICE, because of the huge backlogs, prioritizes adults and families over unaccompanied children. It is also,
so in a way of thinking, they might be intentionally lost or bureaucratically lost by prioritization.
Yes, that is true. And then the other dynamic here when it comes to children not being able to or not deciding to show up for a court hearing, that could very well be that unaccompanied children are deliberately missing their court hearings because they just don't want to follow the legal procedures, or the family, whoever sponsored them, does not want to follow that legal procedure. That could very well be the case, but it could also be that the government, and this happens very often, is sending court notices to addresses that these children no longer live in or that were always the incorrect address from the get-go. That is also true. So it could be that these children are not being notified that they have a court hearing to begin with. Now, all that to say, it is important to note that record numbers of unaccompanied children have entered the U.S. illegally under this administration, and there have been legitimate flaws and concerns corroborated in many reports by government agencies as it relates to the vetting of the sponsors of these children. That the administration, according to these reports, took too many steps to expedite the process to vet these sponsors, and that in some cases at least led to children being placed with potentially dangerous people. That is legitimate, that is true, but again, it does not mean that 300,000 children have been lost by the administration.
And is Tom Homan over-promising when he says we're going to find all 300,000 of these children?
Yes, it's going to be virtually impossible to do that.
Because we don't know where they are.
That's right. And many of their sponsors are undocumented themselves and will not want to
be
contact
raising
the
their
U.S.
hand
government.
saying,
That's
"Here
right.
I am."
Especially under a Trump administration.
And so, as you just said, it's a valid concern about what has happened to some of these children.
That's right.
But not all of them can be theorized
As missing
or exploited.
True. And also, this case or these children are usually mentioned in the context of criticism around family separation under the first Trump administration. When you ask former Trump administration officials about their role in implementing this policy that basically separated migrant children from their parents as a way to deter migration, they will point to the fact that many unaccompanied children have crossed the border under the Biden administration and that many of them, in their perspective, are now missing. But it's not apples to apples because these children cross without their parents. Under the Trump administration, there was a policy to separate children who crossed the border with their parents as a way to prosecute the adults for illegal entry and to deter migration.
And to send a global message.
That's right.
This is not going to be a good place for you. And how bad is it going to be? It's going to be so bad that we're going to separate you from your children.
And as you know, that policy,
which happened also in the Biden and the Obama administration as well.
That policy ended because of public backlash, but also a court ruling that found the separations to be unconstitutional.
There is something else that the incoming Trump administration talks about: birthright citizenship. What is it, and how might it change?
So right now, any child who is born on American soil is
under any condition
generally guaranteed birthright citizenship, irrespective of whether or not their parents are in the country legally. So a child of somebody who crosses the border yesterday and is born today becomes an American citizen automatically. That has always frustrated conservatives and many Republicans because they believe it rewards illegal immigration, because maybe many pregnant women or people who are expecting children come here to the U.S. for the sole purpose of having a U.S. citizen child and enjoying the benefits of what that could actually entail. But it also has to be underscored that many developed countries have a different policy, which is that they require, especially in Europe, at least one parent to have legal status or to be a U.S. citizen for that birthright citizenship to be automatically granted to a child born in their countries. And so we are, in many ways, a special case when it comes to that policy. And, you know, the incoming administration certainly believes that that is a wrong interpretation of the Constitution. So that will face formidable legal challenges.
So we're going to start this conversation now. We're going to carry it over into segment 4. But not only was immigration a big issue in the 2024 campaign, but the idea, the notion, the impression that immigration equaled violence in this country. Begin a conversation about that and how you saw that play out in the last 12 months or so.
Well, we have
like
seen...
I said, we'll carry this over to segment 4. So go ahead.
We have seen high-profile cases of immigrants who are in the country illegally committing crimes against American citizens or other immigrants, whether they're here legally or illegally. And some of those crimes are very heinous and violent. They include murder, rape, sexual assault, and armed robberies, for example. And we have seen cases in New York. We saw, obviously, the murder of the Georgia nursing student, Laken Riley, too, which was mentioned by President Biden in his State of the Union earlier in the year. And we have seen similar cases across the country in states like Colorado, in New York, like I mentioned, and obviously in Georgia. That is true. We cannot deny that.
Right.
People who are coming here to the U.S. sometimes commit crimes, just like the general population. But if you look at every study that has studied this issue, they have never found that illegal immigrants, undocumented immigrants, are committing crimes at a higher rate than native-born Americans or legal immigrants. On the contrary, studies have found that incarceration rates for native-born Americans for crimes, including violent crimes, is actually higher. They're higher, the rates, than for undocumented immigrants.
And in some cases, 2 or 3 times.
That's right. And also, we have to underscore that Border Patrol does keep tab on how many convicted criminals or criminal suspects it arrests at the U.S.-Mexico border. So these are immigrants who have criminal records in the U.S. or in countries that share their information with U.S. officials. And the vast majority of the migrants coming to the U.S., whether they're coming here legally between the ports of entry or at the ports of entry through this app, are non-criminals, people who whether or not they have a valid asylum case, have never committed a crime in the U.S. or in other countries, according to the records that we have. Only a tiny fraction of the people crossing the border come here with criminal records or with some sort of criminal history in their home country. And the reason behind that is because if you have a criminal record in the U.S. and you try to come here again after being deported, you're going to be deported almost immediately under U.S. law.
And you'll have a problematic process if
Right.
you've committed crimes
That's
in
right.
your own country.
But at the same time, I think the reason Republicans seize this issue of criminality among some migrants is because over the past year, we have seen a sharp reduction in illegal immigration at the border. And so the border was not as busy, politically potent anymore. And so they had to shift their messaging a bit to highlight the crimes of people that the Biden administration let in.
And they certainly did that to noticeable political effect. Camilo Montoya-Galvez, it's great to have you with us. Segment 4 of the Takeout, we're going to talk about how much authority states have when it comes to immigration. Because when it comes to California and Texas, we're going to see very different attitudes about that underlying question when we come back.
We are most certainly going to see a legal clash a political clash too, between sanctuary cities, so-called sanctuary cities and states, and the incoming administration.
Welcome back to the Takeout. Camilo Montoya-Galvez is our special guest. So we talked about Texas a little bit.
Yes.
Texas won in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals a decision where it clashed with the Biden administration about putting razor wire and other barriers along the border, specifically at Eagle Pass. That appeared to be a victory for states to say, hey, we have some control over how we engage in immigration practices. California has a very different attitude about this. There's a state law in California that says local law enforcement shall not cooperate with Immigration Customs Enforcement, ICE, on workplace or other kind of immigration checks or procedures that could lead to deportation.
That's right.
There could be a clash in California, a very real clash, and Tom Homan has talked about this, where what is supreme? Is federal supremacy going to cancel that California law, and will mayors and police chiefs and sheriffs be required by the federal government to assist in this process? What's your understanding of this potential clash, and how soon might we see it manifest?
I think we are most certainly going to see a legal clash a political clash too, between sanctuary cities, so-called sanctuary cities and states, and the incoming administration over detainers, which are requests by ICE for local law enforcement to hold on to inmates, criminal inmates, whether people who are charged with crimes or who have finished serving their criminal sentences, to have those local officials hold on to those suspects or convicted criminals, so the agency, ICE, can have time to pick them up and arrest them in that local jail, in that local prison. Many localities in states like California, Maryland, counties across the country, Chicago, New York, limit the cooperation with ICE and either don't adhere to any detainer requests, don't comply with any of them, or only do so when it comes to people who are convicted of very serious crimes like murder and rape and sexual assault. But I think the incoming administration will try to exert a lot of pressure on these communities to not only honor these detainers, but also allow ICE to go into these facilities, these local jails, to arrest people who not just have committed crimes or have been charged with crimes, but who are in the country illegally. And they may try to, for example, withhold federal funding.
And what about workplace inspections?
Well, that is the other major change that could happen, because under the Biden administration, ICE stopped the practice of doing what it calls worksite enforcement, which is basically rounding up immigrants in workplaces. It could be a factory, it could be a poultry plant, or another place where many undocumented immigrants are working in. Because
it could be a construction site.
The argument has been that immigration enforcement should be focused on the employers who are knowingly hiring immigrants who are in the country illegally and who are not authorized to work, not the immigrant workers who in many cases are being exploited or trafficked on a labor perspective. But Tom Homan, the incoming border czar, told us that worksite enforcement is very important to him and that he would likely reinstate it. So we could see what many advocates would call raids or roundups or sweeps, what ICE calls immigration worksite enforcement at these workplaces, including factories. Just like we saw in the first Trump administration, you may recall that there was this big high-profile operation in Mississippi that targeted food processing plants, and hundreds of immigrants were picked up in a single day. That created a lot of controversy. It generated a lot of backlash. Some of those people were deported, but because of the backlash, many of those workers were actually released and allowed to go free. It is very important to note that most of these workers are not criminals, but they are here illegally, and it is a violation of federal law to work here without the government's permission.
And that Mississippi case, if I remember correctly, the backlash wasn't just political, it was economic.
That's right. That's right. Many
Because the employers are like, excuse us,
right.
There's nobody else to do this work.
Yeah, I mean, that is really at the center of the immigration problems that we have in the U.S.
It's going to come to the fore in the next year.
We have an economy and a society that relies on immigrant labor, and much of that immigrant labor consists of people who are in the country illegally, but we have not offered them a path either to staying here or to going home. They're in this limbo phase, and so there have to be decisions made to allow some of them, all of them, or none of them to stay in the U.S., but those decisions have not been made by Congress because we cannot forget to underscore this. Congress, Major, has not updated the U.S. immigration system since 1990, and the country, migration, and the world has changed dramatically since the 1990s.
And let's just go over some of the segments of the U.S. economy in which this thing you just said is true. Hospitality, agriculture, meaning farm workers, and the like. Construction, meat processing, and poultry processing. Landscaping.
That's right.
Those would be the five biggest ones, and then also probably light manufacturing of some kind.
Yes, and it is very important to note that traditionally,
and even probably in some healthcare services, hospitals, things like that.
And traditionally, that has been the main driver that has attracted many Republicans to immigration reform. The fact that many businesses and, for example, the Chamber of Commerce constantly talks about this, rely on immigrant labor for subsistence, and that the U.S. economy would in many ways be devastated by a plan that would entail removing everyone who is in the country illegally from the U.S. Whether or not that actually happens is still an open question because the incoming administration has said that while they will not restrict ICE from deporting anyone who is here illegally, meaning that everyone will be on the table for enforcement who is here illegally, they will still prioritize the detention and deportation of people who are criminals or national security threats.
But they've also used this phrase, which you've referred to a couple of times, self-deportation, meaning this environment is going to be such that people will have a reasonable fear of deportation, so they might leave anyway.
Right.
Well, if they leave the job, that's the same effect on the economy as a deportation. It's just swifter. But that doesn't help the employer who has lost employees, or one or many more, who need the work to be done.
That is true. Not only does it have very important economic consequences, but it also has humanitarian implications. There are about 4 million U.S. citizen children, according to one study, Major, who live with at least one undocumented immigrant parent. And so the possibility, if that parent is targeted for immigration arrests, is that that family could be separated if that parent is deported, or in Tom Homan's view, the family could decide to self-deport to their home country with their U.S. citizen child or children. But that, of course, raises questions about whether those U.S. citizens can be reintegrated or integrated for the first time, actually, in their parents' home country, whether their parents have the economic resources and help in those home countries to help these U.S. citizen children, and whether or not it is in our best interest to be deporting, or at least, paving the way for families to self-deport, which include U.S. citizens from the country.
Camilo Montoya-Galvez, it's been a great pleasure.
Thank you, Major.
Stay tuned for your Takeout Outtake Especial. That's coming up next.
Saving Private Ryan is also my favorite movie that I try to watch on Memorial Day when I can too, or Veterans Day.
Welcome to your Takeout Outtake Especial. Welcome to the Takeout Lounge here on the first floor of the CBS News Bureau. For those of you still with us on Paramount Plus and CBS News 24/7, Camilo Montoya-Galvez is our special guest. Okay, no more rigorous questions about immigration policy, the law, violence, and the like. Fun and games now. You might be familiar with the show. We have 3 questions we ask every guest, so get ready for them.
Okay.
Take them in whichever order you prefer. Most influential book in your life and why? All-time favorite movie? And if you're on a long flight or a long drive, Camilo, and you're going to really groove on some music, what artist or genre is it most likely to be?
Okay, I'll start with the book, Banner Brothers. It actually details the experiences of one of the companies in the 101st Airborne Infantry Division during World War II. And it basically takes you on their entire journey from dropping into Normandy during D-Day to going into Belgium and basically fighting the brunt of the Battle of the Bulge during the 1944 offensive by the German military at the time, and then to capturing Hitler's Eagle's Nest in Austria too. It's a really, I think, inspiring story that actually I use alongside other movies and ESL classes to learn English and to start reading more in English. And it really created a sense of attachment to not only the U.S. military, but to what the U.S. has done for the world in a very positive way, because just like every country, we're not perfect. We have flaws and we have sordid chapters throughout our history, just like every country. But I think on a net basis, the U.S. has been a positive force for the world. And that book really not just highlighted the personal bravery of these men, but also the fact that men from Louisiana, New York, Manhattan, Iowa, Kansas, Oklahoma, California, Oregon could come together to not only liberate Europe, but also to provide the world with some sort of safety and security that, you know, we still value to this day. And that really not just instilled in me a sense of loyalty to the U.S., but also, I think, a sense of admiration for what the greatest generation did for us, for all of us, including immigrants like myself who were not born in the country. And so that, I think, is the book that I always return to on a yearly basis, really. I don't read all of it every year, but I read maybe a chapter or two that I already read like 20 years ago. So I would say that, and they also made a really good HBO show based on that book, Banner Brothers by Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg.
Right.
In terms of a movie, I would say, again, this is showing that I am a World War II history buff. Saving Private Ryan is also my favorite movie that I try to watch on Memorial Day when I can too, or Veterans Day. And to me, not only is the movie really well written and visually striking, but it also, again, even though it's fictional, the account really gives you a good illustration of the bravery of these young men who were often teenagers when they enlisted, and who really saved the world when, to this day, it would be very rare, I think, for somebody in their background, in their fields, and in their age bracket to be asked to do something so formidable and challenging. And so if that makes sense, that is the reason why I would pick Saving Private Ryan. And in terms of music, I listen to a lot of Spanish rock, which I think a lot of our audiences would not know, but I also listen to hip hop and also R&B when I need to de-stressify. Drop
a Spanish rock artist that my audience
Maná. They're a Mexican band, and they have some really good music. They're also politically inclined. I don't adhere to that, but they're a great band. Really, really good in terms of live concerts too. I would recommend seeing them in concert in person.
Excellent. Camilo Montoya-Galvez, thank you very much.
Thank you, Major.
We'll see you next week, folks.